October 26, 1962, a defining moment in Cold War history. President John F. Kennedy had just ordered his State Department to prepare for what were termed crash programs. The United States was gearing up to invade Cuba. Plans were explicit. We will invade Cuba. We shall occupy Cuba, and we shall establish a civil government there. Word of this imminent threat quickly reached Fidel Castro, the Cuban Prime Minister. Understanding the stakes, Castro penned an urgent letter to the Soviet Union. He warned them of two possible scenarios. Number 1, a limited U.S. airstrike targeting key Cuban facilities. Number 2, a full-scale invasion of Cuba that would devastate the island nation. The situation was dire. In a desperate bid to protect Cuba from total destruction, Castro proposed a preemptive nuclear strike on the United States. He urged the Soviet Union to act decisively to deter the looming invasion. The following day, October 27, 1962, would go down in history as Black Saturday, a day when humanity came dangerously close to World War III. The terrifying reality of nuclear war loomed larger than ever before. By noon, tensions escalated when an American U-2 reconnaissance plane breached Cuban airspace. Acting on direct orders from a local commander, the Cuban military fired a missile, shooting down the aircraft. Major Rudolph Anderson, the pilot, perished in the attack, intensifying the already fraught situation. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy was patrolling international waters near Cuba. Unbeknownst to the world at the time, Soviet submarines carrying nuclear weapons were also stationed in the area. One such submarine, the B-59, found itself under attack by U.S. warships, which were dropping signaling depth charges to force it to surface. Conditions aboard the B-59 were unbearable. The intense heat, rising carbon dioxide levels, and total isolation from Moscow created a volatile atmosphere. The submarine had lost all contact with the outside world, and its crew believed that war had already begun. Captain Valentin Savitsky, convinced that they were under attack in the opening moments of a nuclear conflict, made a grim declaration: "We will sink them all. If we die, we'll take them with us." The officers aboard the B-59 had the authority to launch nuclear weapons without needing orders from higher command. They prepared to deploy a nuclear torpedo, a weapon with the same destructive power as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Had it been launched, it would have triggered a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. This crisis, now known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, is a stark reminder of how close the world came to annihilation. But how did we get here? What led to this dangerous confrontation? To fully understand the Cuban Missile Crisis, we must look back to 1898, the year Cuba gained independence from Spain after nearly 4 centuries of colonial rule. While Spain was defeated in the Spanish-American War, Cuba did not immediately achieve full independence. From 1898 to 1902, the island remained under U.S. military occupation. Even after the Republic of Cuba was proclaimed in 1902, its sovereignty was limited. The U.S. retained significant control over Cuba's foreign policies and naval bases through the Cuban Constitution and subsequent treaties. The situation worsened in 1952 when Fulgencio Batista became Cuba's dictator with U.S. support. Batista's regime heavily favored American business interests, leading to stark economic inequality and widespread poverty. By 1959, nearly 40% of Cuba's sugar plantations, 90% of its mines, and most of its utilities and oil industry were owned by American companies. For ordinary Cubans, life was bleak. Healthcare was virtually inaccessible, and diseases like typhoid and tuberculosis were rampant. Corruption, gambling, prostitution, and drug use plagued the nation, while Batista himself was linked to organized crime. These conditions fueled a communist revolution led by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. By 1959, the revolution had succeeded, and Castro's government began nationalizing U.S.-owned businesses. Over 380 American companies, including oil refineries and sugar mills, were seized by the Cuban government. Unsurprisingly, this outraged the United States. President Dwight D. Eisenhower responded with a trade embargo in 1960, cutting off 2/3 of U.S. exports to Cuba. By 1961, the U.S. severed all diplomatic relations with Cuba, closing its embassy in Havana. A new president, John F. Kennedy, took office on January 20, 1961. But the hostility toward Castro's government continued. In April 1961, the infamous Bay of Pigs invasion unfolded. The CIA, with Kennedy's approval, trained and financed over 1,500 Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Castro. The rebels landed at the Bay of Pigs but were quickly defeated by Cuban forces. The failed invasion strengthened Castro's ties with the Soviet Union, which offered military and economic support to protect Cuba from future U.S. aggression. By 1962, the Cold War was intensifying. The Soviet Union, under Premier Nikita Khrushchev, saw an opportunity to counter U.S. influence by deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba. This move was both a defensive strategy to protect Cuba and a means to challenge U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere. On October 15, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane photographed Soviet missile installations in Cuba, sparking a 13-day standoff between the superpowers. President Kennedy convened a secret group of advisors, known as XCOM, to deliberate on the U.S. response. Options ranged from doing nothing to launching a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Ultimately, the U.S. opted for a naval blockade, preventing Soviet ships from delivering additional weapons to Cuba. This decision marked a turning point in the crisis, but the world remained on edge, uncertain whether diplomacy would prevail or if nuclear war was inevitable. Thanks for exploring the past with Ancient Annals. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to uncover more fascinating tales from history. See you in the part 2.